In 1816, people across the Northern Hemisphere stepped outside and felt something that shouldn't exist, a summer that behaved like late autumn. The air stayed sharp, the sky stayed heavy, and in some places, snow and frost showed up when fields were supposed to be green. This wasn't a local fluke. It was a global climate shock, and the first clue was above everyone's head. Sunlight looked wrong. In parts of North America, observers described a persistent, dry fog that dimmed the sun and gave the sky a strange, washed-out glare. The trigger sat on the other side of the world, on the Indonesian island of Sumbawa. In April 1815, Mount Tambora erupted with extraordinary force, one of the largest eruptions in recorded history. Tambora didn't just throw ash into the air, it blasted sulfur-rich gases high into the atmosphere. There, those gases formed tiny sulfate aerosols, a high-altitude veil that reflected and scattered sunlight. The planet didn't go dark like night, but it did receive less solar energy. And when sunlight is muted, the weather doesn't simply get a little cooler. Patterns shift, rain tracks wander, growing seasons shrink. In 1816, the disruption hit hardest where farming was already a tight race against time. In New England and parts of the northeastern United States, the cold arrived in shocking bursts. Frost damaged crops in May. In June, snow was reported in places like Albany, New York, and Dennisville, Maine. In New England and parts of the northeastern United States, the cold arrived in shocking bursts. Frost damaged crops in May. In June, snow was reported in places like Albany, New York, and Dennisville, Maine. In parts of Europe, the story was different but just as destructive. Long stretches of cold, cloudy rain, storms, and repeated setbacks. It wasn't one dramatic day, it was a season that refused to stabilize. For ordinary families, climate was not a theory. It was wet seed in the ground. It was hay that never dried. It was grain that spoiled. It was roads turning to mud and transport slowing down just when food needed to move. When rain dominates the season, the damage stacks up. Fields waterlog. Tools sink. Work windows close. Even successful crops become hard to harvest and store because storage itself becomes damp and unreliable. There's a detail people often miss. A bad harvest isn't only about the field, it's about timing. When rain steals the few dry days you need, you can't cut hay, you can't thresh grain properly, you can't dry anything for storage. Work doesn't stop, it queues up, and then collapses under its own delay. Hay was especially critical. It wasn't a luxury crop, it was winter survival for animals. If hay stayed wet and spoiled, livestock faced a harder winter, and that meant less milk, less meat, fewer working horses, and fewer animals to pull carts or plows. A weather problem becomes an energy problem for the entire economy. Now add the simplest enemy of all, moisture. Damp grain can sprout too early, clump, or become unusable for long storage. Even when families manage to harvest something, they sometimes couldn't preserve it. And once reserves are gone, every storm feels louder because there's no buffer left. Transport made everything worse. Dirt roads turned into deep ruts. Wagons broke more often. Horses tired faster. River crossings became dangerous or simply impassable at times. So even if one region had food, moving it to another region became slower, costlier, and less reliable, exactly when speed mattered most. That's why ports, warehouses, and river barges become part of this story. A sack of grain is not food until it's protected from rain, stored above damp floors, and delivered to a market that's still functioning. In 1816, the same weather that hurt farms also attacked the logistics that could have helped, and the psychological weight was real. People didn't know about stratospheric aerosols. They didn't know why the sun looked pale or why the sky felt wrong. They only knew that plans kept failing. Planting decisions, market trips, repairs, everything had to be redone. A year like this doesn't just take money. It takes confidence. Communities responded in practical ways, sharing tools, drying grain near hearths, repairing roads, reinforcing riverbanks, improvising storage. None of it looks dramatic from far away, but it's history in motion. Small acts of adaptation that decide who makes it through a bad year and who doesn't. And as weeks turned into months, people began to understand that this wasn't a single storm. It was a pattern, a season that wouldn't settle. When nature repeats the same disruption again and again, families stop thinking in days and start thinking in exits, selling what they can, moving or starting over somewhere else. Then prices begin to rise, not because merchants are villains, but because the harvest is smaller and transport is slower. A poor season compresses supply while demand stays the same, and the market turns tense. In the northeastern US, the crisis was especially cruel at higher elevations and frontier settlements. A short growing season became even shorter. One unexpected frost could erase a year's effort in a single night. Across the Atlantic, Europe was already strained by the post-Napoleonic era. When the weather turned against agriculture, it pushed many communities into deeper hardship, food shortages, price pressure, and social stress. And yet, the sky could look strangely beautiful. High-altitude aerosols can intensify sunsets, creating vivid oranges and dramatic gradients. People noticed the light, even while they struggled on the ground. In Switzerland, near Lake Geneva, the miserable weather became part of cultural history. Confined indoors by relentless gloom, a small group, including Mary Shelley and Lord Byron, spent long hours reading and writing. Out of that haunted summer came one of the most famous stories ever written, Frankenstein. Not because weather writes novels, but because weather changes lives, routines, and choices. Now zoom back to the machinery of survival. When local harvests fail, infrastructure becomes the difference between hardship and catastrophe. Warehouses, ports, barges, roads, and the ability to move grain without losing it to moisture. You can picture the chain. Sacks unloaded in rain, canvas pulled tight, barrels rolled into storage, carts fighting through mud. The year without a summer is not just weather, it's a stress test of the entire food system. Even when ships brought grain, distribution wasn't simple. Wet roads slowed wagons, river levels changed, markets fluctuated, and families at the edge of affordability felt every delay in their daily bread. The effects did not stop neatly on December 31st. Many places entered 1817 with depleted reserves and fragile budgets. Recovery takes time because farms and herds cannot rebuild overnight. Here's the most unsettling part. The cause was invisible to most people living through it. No global forecasts, no satellite views, just a stubborn sky, a dim sun, and a calendar that stopped making sense. So in this episode, we're not going to exaggerate. We'll show what historians and scientists actually describe: the eruption, the dimmed sunlight, the summer snow, and the relentless rains, and the very real consequences for food and daily life. One nuance matters: the experience varied by region. Not every place suffered the same way or at the same intensity, but across large parts of Europe and North America, the anomalies were severe enough to disrupt agriculture and push prices upward. And that's the lesson. History isn't only shaped by wars and rulers. Sometimes it's shaped by a thin veil in the high atmosphere a change in light that turned summer into a season of uncertainty. Tambora was a local catastrophe and a global trigger, and 1816 became its echo. Dim sunlight, sudden snow, then soaking rains, and a chain reaction that touched farms, markets, migration, and even literature. If you want more real stories where hidden forces reshape everyday life, subscribe for the next episode.